So I'm Steven. I work with a lot of different startups, early stage, late stage, blue chip, on specifically on how to better tell their story. That's what we're going to talk about today is early stage brand building. I think this was teed up really nicely. It's pretty common at where you are sort of in the process of building a company to think that a lot of the storytelling components, a lot of the narrative components is stuff that's going to come later. We're going to talk today about what you can do right now and the things you should be focusing on versus the things that can wait for later. This worksheet was mentioned. I actually want you to go ahead and grab it for a second, and I'm just going to give you like 60 seconds. I don't want you to think too hard about this. Just intuitively and instinctually answer this question. In as few words as possible, what does your company exist to do? Go ahead and set that to the side. We'll come back to it. To kick things off, I'd love to sort of open up with a question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What's a brand? This is sort of like the most 101 question we've got here, but in your words, what is a brand? Curious if anyone wants to shout out an answer. Something people recognize. Great. What else?
Something we can have loyalty to, like a tribe.
Cool. Something we have loyalty to, like a tribe. Cool. Anything else? Any other thoughts?
Purpose you affiliate with?
Yeah, great. Something you affiliate with. I think these are all sort of like indicative of common answers of how we think about brands. Obviously, if you like Google this, you'll find a million different answers. I think for our purposes, one definition that I have found to be very, very helpful and that we'll talk about today is that a brand is the collection of beliefs that people have about your company. Just to break this down, collection of beliefs, these are opinions, right? Is it cool? Is it useful? Is it interesting? Do I want to use it? Is it fun? Is it a good value? Does the thing work? These are just the opinions people have. When we say people, what we mean by that is like, yes, customers and users, but also partners, investors, potential hires down the road, crypto Twitter, the market. This is the world at large. And then your company, like that's you, but that's also the thing you're building, the team that you're going to onboard, the thing that you're going to deliver to the world. The reason I like this definition is because it's very easy to think about a brand as like a set and forget thing. Like you're going to build it, you're going to set it to the side, and then you're going to focus on your product, and then we're going to use that brand to like wrap the product and allow us to like bring the thing to market. But the reality is that a brand is a lot more like a living organism you have to tend to. It's a thing that evolves, and it's going to evolve alongside your product as the product evolves, as you bring on new employees, as you bring in new users. The way that your brand is perceived by the world, by the different people who interact with it, is going to change. And whenever you release something, you're giving away some of that control of what your brand is. Because the more opinions people have about it, and the more people on your team who are responsible for delivering this product to market, the more complicated the process of managing your brand becomes. So this is sort of the moment to start thinking about what we want our brand to be about. When we talk about brand building, we're talking about the practice of proactively shaping the beliefs that people have about the company that we're building. This is perception management. That is the effective task of building any brand. Now, when you're a scaled company, you have a million different tools for this. Some of these things you're obviously going to be familiar with, some you may not be, but these are all like pieces of marketing, tactic, framework, different things that people use to be able to shape perceptions of brands. Sometimes that's visual, sometimes that's verbal, but all of these are just different approaches on how we can consistently deliver the same ideas to market about who we are and what we want to be known for. But where you all are at the specific stage of building a company, you're in a very different place, and there are sort of a series of like conditions that you have to think about that scaled companies don't. The first is that you don't have a big team yet. Typically, the reason all of those tools exist is because when you have hundreds or thousands of employees, you have all of these people who are responsible for bringing a brand to market in some way, whether that's in product, whether that's in marketing, whether that's in customer success. All of these people are sort of like ambassadors or emissaries of your brand. And so being able to deliver the same ideas consistently is really difficult. You don't have a big team yet. So a lot of that stuff on that slide is not super relevant to you. You also don't have like a robust marketing function. A lot of those things are designed to help drive awareness or trial or adoption or loyalty at different stages of like a marketing funnel. You don't have that yet, probably too early. And so again, some of those things are not going to be super useful to you. Third, you're looking for fit, and you probably don't have it yet. You might have some early customers, you might have some revenue, but you're still trying to prove out the thesis of what you're doing. And so all of those things, very valuable tools, but often just don't apply to where you all are. We need like a looser set of thinking, a looser set of frameworks to help us think about how we tell our story in market. And this is often referred to, unfortunately, this language is kind of cringe. I did not come up with it, but this idea of like a minimum viable brand, like the base set of ideas you're going to use to tell your story to the world. So we're going to talk about minimum viable brand today. A few different things that your minimum viable brand should accomplish. I think 3 things to sort of keep in the back of your head. The first is that it should explain why you exist. And if there's like one slide that you're gonna like really focus on here, I would encourage you to focus on this one. When we talk about like a why, you've probably seen some version of this graphic before. This is created by a guy called Simon Sinek. And the whole premise is that like most companies are able to talk about what they do. We build a product that does X, Y, Z. A lot of companies, but fewer, are able to talk about how they do it. We deliver to market in X, Y, Z way. The why, sort of the center of the bullseye, or the center of the target, is the most important thing, and it's the thing that the fewest number of companies think about. Why do you exist? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? And what are the specific ways that your company is delivering against that problem? And so what happens is if you don't think about this early, you end up down the road where you have a skilled company, where you have a ton of employees and you have a ton of customers, and you're finding that the way that you're talking and showing up in market is really inconsistent. And so you go through an exercise like this to like define your why, but all these opinions about your business have already been formed. And so you now have like so much more friction. You're swimming upstream to try to shift the attitudes and perspectives that people have about your business. If you do it now, and if you think about it now, you have a lot better chance of being able to bring people along for the ride and build that consistency earlier. So the first thing that this thing needs to do, your minimum viable brand, it needs to explain why your company exists. Second, it should explain your story in a compelling way. I imagine you're familiar with Delian from Founders Fund. Delian is like, I think he tends to be like very, very cynical about brand in general, but I think this is a really helpful framework for how to think about this. When you're building a brand story, it's not just about your marketing. You have a ton of secondary and tertiary goals that you're trying to do that if you don't have a compelling story, you sometimes struggle to accomplish. For example, hiring is really difficult. When you have a limited talent pool and you're trying to get the best talent possible, being able to have an interesting, compelling story is a key factor in being able to hire. Obviously, also a big part of being able to raise money. So you want to be able to find the way to tell your story in a compelling and thoughtful way. Third, it should be able to differentiate you from competitors. This is especially true if you're working on anything that has a higher risk of being commoditized. The classic example here is like an AMM. I've worked with plenty of companies who have decided to pivot to an AMM, and they all sort of find the same thing. It's like, damn, like Uniswap is kind of crushing. People really like that. I don't know what to do. And so what you find is that the only thing that's going to be able to set you apart is the way you tell your story, the way you build your brand, and sort of the community that you build based off of those ideas. So we've sort of established what we need to build, minimum viable brand, why it's super valuable. The question is like, how do we do it? Like, what are the things we actually tactically want to focus on? And so 2 areas that I think are really useful. One is the story itself. Like, what is the language we're going to use? How are we going to talk about this thing? What are the ideas we want to own in the market? How do we talk about the way that we're solving a problem? And the other side of this is visual identity. What do we look like? Now, I will say brand story is sort of like where I live day to day, and so I'll spend a little bit more time on that, and we can sort of dig into the weeds. Visual identity, I'll talk about at a high level. We're going to start with brand story, talk a little bit around how we tell our story, how we can think about this. Brand story is super useful. It helps you crystallize that why. It helps you figure out the specific ways that you define a problem in the market and the ways that you work to solve that problem. It's the reason that you exist in the world. And if you can land this, you're in a much better place than most. It also gives you language that you can use to test and iterate. Again, a brand is like a living thing, right? Like it's a thing that is going to grow and evolve over time. And so ideally, when we start out, we have language that we're going to use, but we're going to test it with the people we talk to. We'll test it with customers. We'll test it with investors. We'll test it with people that we trust. And we'll get feedback on what ideas are resonating. And as the product evolves, so too will the language along with it. So it gives you the first set of language you're going to test and iterate on. And then third, it builds goodwill with the public. This is sort of like a back pocket thing, but in the worst case scenario, something goes wrong, there's some kind of like crisis. If you've built a solid brand with a good reputation that people trust and people admire and people like, they tend to give you more of the benefit of the doubt in a moment of crisis. So having a good, clear story, super useful. I think the way to sort of best unpack this is through the lens of a company that does a really good job at storytelling. And it's one you're all going to be familiar with. We're going to talk about Zora. I think Zora has done sort of an amazing job from the very beginning of owning a specific idea in the market and then being able to evolve that idea to be more and more relevant to what they're doing and to the audience that they're serving. So sort of 3 steps here that have sort of guided them on how they tell their story. The first is being really clear about what that problem is. When Zora first launched, it was designed to be an NFT marketplace where creators could launch their own sort of NFT project. People could buy and sell from there. And right after they launched, Jacob, one of the co-founders, gave this talk where he was sort of talking about the conditions of how we think about information ownership. And he did a really good job of defining the problem that exists in the market, that all of these platforms like Instagram and TikTok and Spotify, these are all essentially like private networks. And they have found the way to take ownership of the media that normal, regular people create, and then they monetize it, and the creators are ones who are getting paid in softer things like social currency, like likes and follows. And so this is sort of the established mental model of how we think about internet ownership, or excuse me, information ownership. He talks about this idea that like we've never escaped intranets, really. So a really clear definition of the problem. And I think one thing that's really interesting here is that they did a great job of like establishing an idea or a meme around like what this new future that they were working towards looks like. And they called it the internet renaissance. This idea where there was going to be this new future where creators were going to be able to use technology to be able to own the distribution, to own their community, own the relationship with their community, and thus like reap the spoils of their creation. And so creating language like this became super useful as Zora started to grow. Now, they were not saying we're the ones who are ushering in the internet renaissance. They were saying, like, we are observing this thing, we see this problem, we see a new thing that's starting to emerge because of NFTs and the ability of like a distributed network to be able to disintermediate control of content. And so we are going to be a part of that movement. We're going to be part of this internet renaissance by doing our own thing. They explained how they solved the problem that they saw in the world. And so the mission that they have, the specific piece of language that they use, is that our mission is to make creating on the internet free and valuable. And they built out all of this additional language underneath, right? Like they have, I think they call these their beliefs. Some people call them values. Some people call them pillars. Some people call them benefits. But they create this language that explains the ways in which they make creating on the internet free and valuable. And so it's really detailed. It's really thoughtful. It's very, very specific to them. But then they pay it off in the actual product. This GIF is from a couple days ago. If you go on Zora's marketplace, you can see all of these creators who have made pieces of art of varying degrees of quality but they own and that they distribute and that they have sort of created a relationship with the people who are collecting it around. And so these sort of 3 things, defining the problem, explaining how you solve that problem, and then proving it in your product, is sort of a really sort of simple 3-step process of thinking about a brand story. If you want to get even more tactical around like what language should we think about building, so 3 things I think that would be worth your time. The first is like, what is our why? And this is where you're going to spend the most time thinking. Again, defining the problem, defining the way that we solve it. Second, getting really clear on benefits. What are the things that we're delivering to market? What are the reasons someone would want to use this? Why is that valuable? Why would someone want to use our product versus someone else? And then third, and this is sort of like the unsung hero of a brand strategy, but it's tone of voice. I think you want to be really thoughtful around how you're communicating. It's not just the ideas you're saying, but the specific language that you're using and the tone of voice that you're delivering it to. You can imagine having very different audiences and wanting to adapt your tone to best fit them. So spending some time thinking and defining really clearly what our tone of voice is really helpful, especially when the way a lot of people are going to experience your company and your business is not only through the product you're building, but like on Twitter or on the communications that you're putting out into market. So that's brand story. That's sort of this first component. The second is visual identity. Now, this is a place where I think I would expect a lot of you would want to work with a partner on this. You all are here because you're building cool crypto products, not because you're amazing visual designers. Maybe you are both, and more power to you, go with God. But the expectation is probably that you're going to work with a design partner in some capacity. Maybe you'll work with a strategy partner on brand story, but you will almost definitely work with an external design partner on building a visual identity. And so some things for you to think about as you start thinking about working with a partner and the stuff that matters to you. The first, you want to think about your audience. If you are building a product that is designed to help crypto degens like buy shitcoins, Again, go with God, that's your business. But the identity that you have is going to be very different from the identity you would build for a product where the audience was institutional investors. You want to be really, really thoughtful about what's like the vibe that's going to matter most to the people that I'm building for. Second, you want to look at what your competitors are doing. In your specific niche, what are the vibes like? And what are the things that you like? What are the things that you don't like? What are the things that are sort of expected for the category? And what are the ways that you can do something unique and interesting and ownable? And then third, you want to define the vibe you're going for. This is like the process of briefing a design partner. What's the vibe that you like? What's the energy you want to put out into the world that you want to represent your brand? Again, if you've done the work of like defining your brand story, this can also provide a really helpful guardrail. Think about Zora. They're talking about creating on the internet free and valuable. That's a really great creative brief to a designer. Your job is to visualize what the idea of a new internet renaissance that's where a world that's free and valuable for creators, like that's your design brief. And most designers, even though that may sound like an insane thing to say to a designer, most of them are going to be really stoked on a brief like that because it's really weird and it's really exciting. I want to talk about an example here of a company that does brand identity really, really well, and I think is arguably like one of the best in crypto, and it's Party. Party, if you're not familiar, is a tool that allows people to do stuff together on chain. Their mission is to make crypto multiplayer, which is a fantastic piece of language, by the way. You can put that in your back pocket as well for thinking about your brand story. But the idea of making crypto multiplayer, their sort of key objective is making it really simple for people to do stuff together on chain. Own assets, buy assets, sell assets, take action. And so when they created their brand identity, three kind of key things that were really, really smart here. The first is that it was connected to the brand story. If the whole idea is about multiplayer, about doing stuff together, about bringing your group on chain, they've got a logo mark that shows 4 different cursors moving in the same direction. There's a very literal connection between the story they're telling and the way that they're representing that visually. So really thoughtful connection here that I think makes the identity that much stronger. Second, they've designed something that is like very, very flexible. This is like a little OP. Like I'd be really impressed if anyone at this stage was able to develop an identity that was like this robust, but they've built this system, this identity system that allows them to build visual communications that are very, very flexible. So they have a logo for the company, they have a logo for the app, they have this mascot called Kazoo, they have a logo for the protocol, like the open source set of contracts beneath it, and then they've got this like quality seal that sort of is like reminiscent of old Nintendo video games that you would see like on the cover or on the box. And so as a result, they've sort of, when you look at any communication that comes from Party, not only is it really opinionated, but like it doesn't look like anyone else. Like you can recognize a Party, a piece of Party marketing, a piece of the Party brand, kind of regardless of what you're looking at. And it's because they've spent all of this time thinking about what is the visual system and how do we want this to show up. If you're building a consumer brand versus a B2B brand, this is increasingly important. I would imagine if you're building like, something related to like ZK proofs, you probably don't have to think this hard about brand. But if you're building a consumer product, significantly more valuable. Some elements you're going to want to consider: logo, obviously, like what is the mark that represents the brand? That might be a symbol, that might be a word mark, could be a combination of the two, but like what's the logo? Obviously a good starting place. Color palette, what's the deck going to look like? What's the website going to look like? What colors do we want to use? And then typeface. Usually most companies will use a combination of 2 or more to sort of give some like nice visual contrast between like a headline on a website and copy. The last bit I want to share, just a couple of like parting thoughts. These are sort of scattered thoughts that don't neatly plug in anywhere else in the deck. And then we'll do a little Q&A. A few things that you should keep in mind as you're going through this process. The first is that you want to be careful of brand stories that have already been taken. You see this a lot when an incumbent will come along and they'll establish sort of a big idea in the market, and then a ton of people like fast follow and say that they're kind of about the same things. Things like building a new internet, things like making finance free and accessible and fair and equitable. All of these are ideas that people like Coinbase, A16Z actually did a really good job of establishing very early, this idea of like the new internet that was going to be built. And now whenever someone says anything like this, they just kind of feel like, yeah, like not original, not super interesting. So you want to be thoughtful about using language that feels relevant to the industry that you're working in and the niche that you're operating in, but also isn't something that is like already taken and sort of overcooked. Second, you want to be really thoughtful about naming things. Things get tricky when the name of your company is the same as the name of your team, is the same as the name of your protocol. You often find this with like lending protocols. If someone says like Aave, they could be talking about like one of 7 different things. And so being thoughtful about your nomenclature, having a different name for your protocol, you can do something like OpenSea versus Seaport, or you can also do something like party app versus party protocol. But just having some distinction makes comprehension a little bit easier for a consumer. Third, don't handcuff yourself to the current meta. You see this a lot with like a couple years ago, everyone was like building a brand around saying like GM and WAGMI, and now that's like deeply painful to read. And so you don't want to like handcuff yourself to just like the current vibes. You want something that's going to last longer than whatever the current cycle is. Fourth, again, you're going to refine your brand story as your product evolves. You don't need to like come up with the idea today that's going to last you 2 or 3 years. You need to come up with the idea today that's going to last for right now. And so you should feel comfortable evolving your thinking as time goes on. I mentioned this before, but visual identity is especially important if you're building a consumer business. B2B, there are some things you should think about. A lot of it has to do more with like expressing like the clear utility of what you're building rather than like building cool vibes. But I would, if anyone, I know a few of you are building like consumer specific businesses. I would be thinking a lot more about visual identity than some of your like B2B colleagues. The more saturated the market, the more differentiated you need to be. So if you are finding yourself in a place where you have a ton of competitors, then you want to be really thoughtful in the story that you're telling and making sure it feels differentiated. You're probably going to work with partners. I mentioned this on the design side. Maybe you'll work with a strategy partner. You'll probably work with a design partner. You will find lots of like small agencies, which are typically just like dudes who are going to tell you like it costs $50,000 to do a brand. That's fucking stupid. Don't do that. That's like way too much money to be spending right now. You can think about that like after your A maybe, or maybe after your seed, depending on how much you want to invest in brand. You want to work with like individuals or very small teams that have like taste and perspective you trust. So if you're working with a partner, ask to see case studies, ask to hear examples, have them walk you through how they approached building a brand or building a brand story to get a sense of like, if you vibe with how they think, because your partnership is going to be really, really important to the quality of the product that you're getting on the back end. But don't, if they're saying they're an agency, if they're saying that they're, an independent consultancy, which is also famously what I say, you should be wary of that and know that usually is just trying to like drive up the price. Lastly, and this is just to kind of take the pressure off. This is like a lot of information very, very quickly. And I can imagine a world where like this could feel a little overwhelming, especially if you haven't thought about brand at all. The good news is like, we're thinking about a very short horizon. You should be thinking about getting to your next round of funding. So after demo day, like I would be thinking about, a little bit of ways down the road, not thinking multiple years. One of the reasons that brand building often costs so much money is because an agency is trying to help you build something that's going to last 3 to 5 years. If you don't have fit, you have no idea what 18 months is going to look like, let alone 3 years. And so you should be thinking on much shorter horizons. Give yourself the freedom and the flexibility to focus on what's working right now, and then you can refine and evolve as you go. Cool. So that's sort of high level, some thoughts on how you might think about brand. I'd love to sort of open it up. If folks have questions, would love to hear any questions you might have.
What do you think about AI-generated branding for pre-seed, just to get to the next round?
Yeah, do you mean like using like Midjourney or something for
example,
identity? Yeah, I mean, I think that stuff like looks like Midjourney. If you're really good at prompting and you're able to make it, like some designers are incredible at prompting Midjourney or whatever generative tool to create stuff that does not look like it came out of an AI. I think that like cheapens. If you're not able to do that, it kind of cheapens the perception of like why your brand is valuable. So I would be cautious. If it were me, if I were in your shoes, I would probably spend that time on a very like focused design exercise to just get like a super simple logo rather than having something that looks more robust, but like feels very obviously AI generated.
In the vein of what we can do as early stage companies to equip ourselves to get the brand ready for the next round, an experience I've had is that we can work with people to kind of hone in on the brand DNA and things like the compelling visuals that fit into that. And one of the challenges I found is how to efficiently operationalize that, where you get a report saying, kind of here's your core brand tenants and some good base visuals. Like, in terms of operationalizing that in practice, is it just kind of thoughts on using, for example, like design contractors that you could, kind of like once every couple of weeks versus someone full time versus the agency. Kind of an open-ended question, but hopefully that makes sense.
No, I'm really glad you asked it because it gives me a chance to kind of like riff on something. No, I think that the challenge here is that usually when you're on my side of things and you're the person who's like working with startups, typically you like came up through the agency world and you learned all of these frameworks, like how to build positioning, how to build brand values, how to build these like very useful things for a scaled company. And so when you start working with startups, the first thing that like contractors will often do is they'll say, okay, like, well, what are the most important things? Like, what is the simplest elements from that, and I'll just build those things for this client. The problem is, like, again, you have a totally different context. So usually, like, when I work with an early stage company, what I'm trying to think about is like, I don't need to necessarily give you a specific type of execution. Maybe you really want a mission statement, or maybe you really want a positioning statement. But if you don't have an opinion, my job is to like help you walk away feeling really confident in telling your story and having a really tactical, easily executable piece of language that you can use in a variety of different contexts. And so what I would be thinking about if I was in your shoes is like, what are the things that I feel like I need? Where are the ways in which I feel like I'm not telling my story effectively? And then working with someone and almost thinking of it more as like a coaching relationship as opposed to like a contractor relationship where like they're going to deliver you XYZ deliverables. That's on the brand story side. If you're building an identity, you should have a very specific set of deliverables that you walk away with. That should be a logo, a color palette, a typeface. They might try to sell you on brand principles unless you have like a designer or a couple of designers and you feel like that's really important for like building your product. I would not buy design principles. You're not really there yet. But yeah, so I would think tactically, very, very tactically about design outcomes and very like coach mentor vibes on the strategy side. Great question.
I had a question about the different names that you'd give to the company versus the different products or tools that you're building. In our case, for example, the company is called Compass Labs, but our main product is called Dojo, and I feel like actually it confuses people a lot, like because they don't understand if it's our company or a product or what other products are coming. And I wonder what you suggest to do there, because the OpenSea example has still like both C in it. So like, curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's funny. When I was looking at, I looked all y'all up before I got here, but when I was looking you up, I was like, I wonder why they call it Dojo. It's a little confusing. So we're on the same page. No shade. Like, you guys are building cool stuff. But yeah, no, I think that's right. Like, when you have two different names, you want there to be like some kind of like spiritual through line between them.
Yeah.
OpenSea and Seaport. It's like, okay, I can sort of like grok what that means. I think it's like early enough where you can think about which of those two ideas, like a compass or a dojo, which of those is like more compelling to you. And depending on where you are in terms of like customers, where you are in terms of like how many people have started using this product, I would think about pivoting one of them and thinking about how we can build like a cohesive narrative about the two. But I think we have time set up on the calendar to talk about this. We should chat about this.
Okay.
I think there's there's a lot to riff on.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, great question.
I'm curious, like getting back to the why. What are like one or two questions that you find most helpful to ask a company to like crack at that more specifically and brainstorm around that?
Yeah, this is a tricky one because, well, I'll tell you the question first, and then I'll tell you why it's tricky. I always sort of start with, like, if I'm working with a founder, I want to know, like, why do you have skin in the game? And sometimes you have people who, like, have a really compelling background story where they're like, I experienced this, like, super fucked up thing that happened, and, like, now I'm trying to solve that problem. That is a really clear, like, linear way to, like, get into a why. Where things get tricky, though, is, like, people are kind of aware of that, like, that idea of, like, mine my personal trauma and use it as like the reason why I'm a sick founder. And if it's not specific to the problem you're solving, it feels really like gross. And so so I always start with that question, but like what I'm trying to figure out is like, cool, is the problem you had actually a thing you're solving, or are you just kind of like glum about what's going on, and so you decided to do something cool in the world? If it's the latter, that's not a good enough reason to start. If it's the former, cool, that's a really good way into your why. But yeah, I mean, I think like most founders are doing something because they really care about the problem, not because they're like, I'd really love to be a crypto founder and make a fuck ton of money. And so what's like the fastest way that I can do that? But yeah, most people are bought in for another reason. And so trying to like uncover and unpack what that thing is a really good place to start.
One of the things you focused on was understanding the customer and linking that customer to the brand. And I felt Ethereum did an amazing job of this somehow in it pitching smart contracts to people who didn't know what they were and creating an entire community around it. How, given that they were only working with people who knew digital currency from Bitcoin before?
It's an interesting question that I think I understand. Yeah, like I think anytime the thing you're building is very abstract and people don't have a current metaphor for yet, your job is to like build that metaphor. You often see this with super technical companies. Like I feel like ZK, I know several of you are working on ZK stuff. And so I think ZK is a good example. When you think about a company like Aztec and the way that they approach ZK, their whole shortcut, they have to find like the mental shortcut they can bring you on to say like, what does this thing do? You can talk about multi-party computation and like the specific mathematical things that are happening in the background. And that's super helpful for a specific type of user. But you also need to be able to have an answer to the question of like, why does this thing work and why is this valuable? And so Ethereum, like, yes, they have had to find like the metaphor for like how to explain what a smart contract is and what account abstraction is and what all of these technical things are. But they also just kind of talk about like why we need a new framework for how money moves. And that is like a really useful way to get people who are not technical onboarded to your brand. Now they have the tricky thing of having multiple audiences where like they have people who are just going to like use Ethereum who are not building something, and then also having people who are building. And so when you have that sort of dynamic, you have to play at a couple different levels, and you have to build out messaging and thinking about both of those audiences. But if you are just focused on developers, or if you're just focused on consumers, you have a much sort of simpler job. Does that answer your question?
It really does.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going with that.
Cool.
In the why, how, what framework, what is the balance between those components and telling your story? And you actually just talked a little bit about it in your last answer, but it seems like there might not be necessarily a perfect fit of always focusing on why, even though that's a very powerful part of what you're doing. But given the way that you've broken down kind of brand identity, visuals, love to understand kind of the interplay between the two.
It's a great question. I often think about like the maturity of the industry as a good shortcut. There are a lot of ways you could think about it. If you're building in a nascent category, the why is way more important because that's the easiest thing to connect to. We have this abstract problem that we're trying to solve. That's what the company is about. People are going to understand the problem more than they're going to understand the future that you're trying to build towards. So nascent stage category, focus on the why. If there's some decent competition within your niche, then much more valuable to focus on the how, if that is like your key differentiator. If your approach or your methodology or the way that you're delivering this thing is different, how becomes way more important. There are very few examples of like when what is the most valuable thing, unless you were in like a category that has very limited competition, and usually you're focusing on like that often is like practical like CPG product marketing. Like it's a functional sports beverage that delivers, whatever fucking stuff they put in drinks now. Like that is when you talk about the what. But I would think about like where do we differentiate? Like where can we talk about why we're sick relative to our competitors? And that is like a good place. You should have all three, but that's where I think you can like focus how you tell the story. Great
Thank
question.
you.
Yeah.
So my question is kind of related to the metaphor analogy you just talked about. If we were building something that's kind of new, for example, we're building like an authentic data layer that's trying to make like data pipeline authentic, but then like it's harder to explain there. But if we use a metaphor, it's going to go closer to, for example, an Oracle, which there are a lot of competitors and established companies there. So would you say we should like go with a new narrative, a new approach, describe a new thing to our customers, or should we go with that metaphor and then try to say how we are different? Because that has been pretty challenging so far because people has a very strong a perspective already on it.
Sure. I think it's a good question. I think we should chat more in depth because I think there could be an argument for both. My instinct here is like, if you've been trying one and you're finding it's not working, try something else. Like, you don't have to feel super committed to any one piece of language. If you're finding that like, cool, if we talk about this in like the metaphorical way that a bunch of our competitors are talking about, and it means that we are like forced out by a bunch of incumbents, cool, let's try talking about it in a completely different way. And sort of you're using a different strategy of saying, yeah, there are 8 different people who are working on this problem. 7 of them are like this, and one of them, us, is like this. And so you should be trying both. And whatever gets traction is what's best.
How do you build a brand if the community that you're building for gets really nervous about any crypto-related language or smart contracts or anything?
Yeah, what are you building?
Basically, we provide trusted data to AI models and applications, so all the stuff around copyright data, etc.
Got it. And so, yeah, okay. So then, yeah, I mean, I think, so some people have the attitude of like, we're going to hide it, not like be sneaky about it, but just like the fact that it's crypto is not relevant to the solution that we're delivering. If you find that you're in that position, might be worth trying. There are other ways of like when you have a group of people who are like a little allergic to like the vibes of your category, which is not uncommon in crypto, then some of what you're doing is educating people on like how you are not like those other girls. And like you have a different, there's a different reason why you're valuable and why this specific relationship that you have to crypto is not like degens or, whatever else people are sort of allergic to. But we should also chat in depth because I'm curious to hear about like what specific discomfort people have. But it's a great question.
This is maybe on the line between a question and a workshop thing, but
Right.
say you got a name for your company and you've built some kind of brand reputation around that, but it kind of no longer quite matches what you're doing. How do you balance that decision of whether to change your name or not?
Yeah, classic answer, it depends. But I think generally like if you've built a reputation around your brand, that's something that's really valuable and worth keeping. If it is something where it's just like not, the vibes aren't the same, there are easier ways to solve for that. If the name of your company is sports drink manufacturer and now you make lacrosse balls, that's like a problem. And so you have to figure out like how to, that's like where a name change is probably really appropriate. But depending on the distance between where you started and what you're doing and how descriptive your name is versus what you're doing, there are ways to message around this as opposed to changing your name and giving up some of your like brand equity that you've built in. I will say a lot of people change names. Like this happens this is like a pretty common occurrence. There are just like specific approaches to how you message a name change that we can talk through. But yeah, it's a great question.